My son stood on my doorstep holding white roses, the same flowers he'd brought to his father's funeral, while I counted the $3 million his uncle had just deposited in my account. The irony wasn't lost on me that David had chosen the exact flowers that symbolized new beginnings, because this was certainly going to be a fresh start for both of us. What he didn't know was that I'd spent the last week planning exactly how to make him pay for stealing my house and leaving his 64-year-old mother to sleep in her Honda Civic for 2 weeks. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Let me back up and tell you how a retired elementary school teacher from Ohio ended up homeless, then millionaire, then plotting revenge against her own child. My name is Margaret Sullivan, though everyone calls me Maggie. And 6 months ago, I thought I was the luckiest mother alive. I had a beautiful house in Westerville that my late husband Tom and I had paid off after 30 years, a comfortable pension, and a son who seemed to genuinely care about my well-being. David would call twice a week, visit every Sunday for dinner, and always insisted on helping with yard work or minor repairs. "Mom, you're getting older," he'd said over pot roast one evening in June. "What if something happens to you in this big house? What if you fall down the stairs?" His wife, Vanessa, nodded sympathetically. "We worry about you living alone, Maggie." Their concern seemed so genuine, so loving. David had inherited his father's earnest brown eyes and soft-spoken manner, and when he looked at me with such worried affection, my heart melted. That's when they presented their solution. "We've been thinking," Vanessa said, her voice gentle. "What if we moved in here with you? We could take care of the house, help with everything, and you wouldn't have to worry anymore." David leaned forward eagerly. "And Mom, to make it official and protect your assets, we should probably transfer the deed into my name. That way, if anything happens, there won't be any legal complications." I should have seen the red flags. I should have questioned why a 39-year-old man and his wife suddenly wanted to live with his elderly mother. Instead, I saw it as the answer to prayers I didn't even know I'd been saying. They moved in that July, and for exactly 6 weeks it was wonderful. David mowed the lawn and fixed the creaky porch step. Vanessa cooked elaborate dinners and redecorated the guest room. They insisted on paying all the utilities and groceries as their contribution to the household. But fairy tales don't last, especially when they're built on lies. The first crack appeared on a sweltering August afternoon when I overheard David on the phone in Tom's old study. "Yeah, the deed transfer went through last month," he was saying. "Once we get her moved out, we can renovate the whole upstairs and probably get $750 for it in this market." My blood turned to ice water. Moved out. I stood frozen outside the door, my hand gripping the doorframe so hard my knuckles went white. The conversation I overheard that day changed everything, though I was too shocked to act on it immediately. Instead, I became a spy in my own home, paying attention to details I'd previously ignored, like how David and Vanessa had started receiving mail addressed to our house even before they moved in, like how Vanessa had begun rearranging furniture and removing my personal photos, claiming she wanted to freshen up the decor, like how they'd both grown irritated whenever I wanted to use the living room in the evenings, suggesting I'd be more comfortable upstairs in my bedroom. The second conversation I overheard was even more damning. It was a Tuesday night in early September, and I'd come downstairs for a glass of water. They were in the kitchen, voices low but intense. "She's getting suspicious," Vanessa was saying. "Yesterday, she asked me why I was looking at real estate websites." David's response made my stomach drop. "We need to move faster then. I'll call Peterson tomorrow about the power of attorney papers." Power of attorney. The words hit me like a slap. They weren't just planning to sell my house. They were planning to have me declared incompetent so they could control all my assets. 35 years of marriage to Tom, 30 years of teaching third graders, a lifetime of careful saving and responsible living, and my own son was plotting to steal it. All. I crept back upstairs and sat on my bed in the dark, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they'd hear it downstairs. How long had this been planned? Had David's Sunday dinners and concerned phone calls all been part of some elaborate scheme? I thought about the deed transfer I'd signed so trustingly, believing it was just paperwork to protect my interests. The lawyer David had insisted we use was his golf buddy, someone who'd rushed me through the signing with barely an explanation. The next morning I called my own attorney, Harold Weinstein, who'd handled Tom's estate. Harold, I need to understand something about my house, I said carefully. If the deed is in my son's name, but I'm still living here, what are my legal rights? The silence that followed was longer than I expected. Maggie, Harold said, finally, if the deed is in his name, he owns the house. You're essentially a tenant at will. He could ask you to leave at any time. A tenant at will in the house where I'd raised my child, where I'd nursed my husband through cancer, where I'd planned to live out my golden years. I hung up the phone and walked through the rooms that suddenly felt foreign. The kitchen, where I'd packed thousands of school lunches, the living room where David had taken his first steps, the master bedroom where Tom had died in my arms 3 years ago. None of it belonged to me anymore. That afternoon, while David was at work and Vanessa was at her book club, I did something I'd never done before. I searched their belongings. In Vanessa's jewelry box, I found business cards for 3 different real estate agents. In David's desk drawer, I discovered printed emails about home renovation loans and a folder labeled Mom's finances that contained photocopies of my bank statements going back 2 years. How had he gotten those? The answer was simple and devastating. He'd been planning this for a very long time. The end came swiftly once I knew what to look for. 3 days after my discovery, David sat me down for what he called a serious conversation about your future, Mom. He'd prepared a speech. I could tell because his words came out too smoothly, too rehearsed. Vanessa and I have been talking, he began, and we think it would be best for everyone if you moved into assisted living. There's a really nice place called Sunset Manor that has an opening. Sunset Manor. I knew the place. It was where Martha Henderson from church had gone when her family decided she was too much trouble to care for at home. Martha had died within 6 months, not from illness, but from a broken heart. I don't need assisted living, I said quietly. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. David's patronizing smile made my skin crawl. Mom, you're 64 years old. Last week, you left the stove burner on. Yesterday, you couldn't remember where you put your car keys. Both statements were lies, but I didn't bother correcting him. The stove incident had been him cooking breakfast before work. The car keys had been in Vanessa's purse after she'd borrowed my car for errands. But facts weren't going to matter here. Besides, Vanessa added with false sweetness, Sunset Manor has all sorts of activities. Game nights, craft classes, movie screenings. You'd love it there. And what happens to this house? I asked, though I already knew the answer. David and Vanessa exchanged a quick glance. Well, since it's in my name now, we'll probably sell it, David said. The real estate market is really good right now. And honestly, Mom, maintaining a house this size is getting expensive. The money from the sale will help pay for your care. Help pay for my care. More. Lies. I'd already looked up Sunset Manor's rates online. Even their most expensive private room cost less per month than my house was worth. The remaining money would disappear into David and Vanessa's renovation dreams and vacation plans. I need some time to think about this, I said finally. David's face hardened slightly. Mom, we're trying to do what's best for you. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. 2 days later, I woke up to find all the locks changed. I stood on my own front porch at 7 in the morning, still in my nightgown and robe, holding my purse and the small overnight bag I'd packed the night before when I'd sensed something was coming. David opened the door, just wide enough to speak through the gap. "I'm sorry, Mom, but this is for your own good," he said. "The people from Sunset Manor will be here at 10 to pick you up. There's no point in making a scene, as if a mother, expecting to live in her own home, was being dramatic." "David, please," I said, hating how my voice shook. "Can we just talk about this?" But he was already closing the door. Through the window, I could see Vanessa in the kitchen making coffee, as if nothing unusual was happening, as if they hadn't just made their mother homeless. I stood there for 20 minutes, hoping David would come to his senses, hoping this was some sort of misunderstanding that could be resolved with conversation. But the Sunset Manor van pulled up at exactly 10 o'clock, and I knew my old life was over. The two kind but firm attendants tried to convince me to come peacefully. Mrs. Sullivan, older woman, said gently, "Your son has already completed all the paperwork. Your room is ready, and we have some lovely activities planned for this afternoon." I looked at my house one more time at the flower garden Tom and I had planted together at the porch swing where I'd read thousands of bedtime stories to David when he was small. Then I turned to the attendants and said the words that changed everything. "I'm not going with you." Instead, I walked to my Honda Civic, got in, and drove away from the only home I'd known for 33 years, leaving my son and his wife with exactly what they wanted: a house and the freedom to pretend I'd never existed. Living in your car teaches you things about yourself you never wanted to know, like how long you can go without a real shower before even you can't stand your own smell, like how much your back can hurt from sleeping in a front seat, tilted back as far as it will go, like how invisible you become to the rest of the world when you don't have an address. I spent my first night in the parking lot of a 24-hour Walmart, feeling like a criminal every time a security guard walked by. The second night, I tried a rest stop on I-7, but the constant noise of trucks and the fear of what might happen to a lone elderly woman kept me awake until dawn. By the third night, I'd found my rhythm. Park behind a Denny's after the dinner rush, use their restroom before they closed, buy a coffee and a muffin to justify my presence, then sleep until the morning staff arrived. The hardest part wasn't the physical discomfort. It was the shame. Every time I walked into a store or restaurant, I felt like everyone could tell I was homeless. I'd catch my reflection in windows and see a disheveled woman with gray hair that hadn't been properly styled in a week, wearing the same 3 outfits I'd grabbed from my closet that final morning. I looked exactly like what I was, someone who'd fallen through the cracks. On day 5, I called David. I told myself it was about retrieving more of my belongings, but really I was hoping he'd come to his senses. The phone went straight to voicemail. I tried Vanessa's number with the same result. Finally, in desperation, I drove by the house. There were painters on the front porch, and through the open windows I could see workers tearing down the wallpaper in what used to be my dining room. They were already erasing every trace of my existence. The irony was that I wasn't poor. Not really. I had my pension, Social Security, and about $40,000 in savings, but without an address, I couldn't access most of it. Banks don't like to deal with customers who can't provide a permanent residence. Hotels were too expensive for long-term stays. Apartments required credit checks, references, first and last month's rent up front. Everything in modern life assumes you have a place to call home. By day 10, I developed a routine that felt almost normal. Coffee and bathroom at McDonald's, at 6 a.m. shower at the YMCA, where I'd bought a basic membership by claiming I was temporarily between residences, lunch at the public library where I could use Wi-Fi and pretend to read while actually just trying to stay warm and clean. Dinner at whatever restaurant had early bird specials. Nursing a single meal for as long as possible. It was at the library on day 14 that everything changed. I was checking my email when I saw a message from an address I didn't recognize, or sullivan.prizes@gmail.com. The subject line read Maggie or Brother Bobby. My heart stopped. I hadn't spoken to my brother Robert in 3 years. Not since Tom's funeral, when he'd made a speech about family sticking together through tough times. Bobby was 2 years older than me and had done well for himself in commercial real estate development. We'd grown apart over the years, partly due to geography and partly because his success had always made me feel inadequate. The email was short. Maggie, I heard through the grapevine what happened with David and that house situation. I'm flying into Columbus tomorrow morning. Meet me at the Hilton downtown at noon. We need to talk. Your brother, who should have called sooner, Bobby? I read the message 3 times, wondering who the grapevine was and what exactly Bobby had heard. More importantly, I wondered if I was ready to face my older brother while I was living in my car and hadn't had a proper meal in 2 days. But pride is a luxury homeless people can't afford. The next day, I used my last clean outfit and arrived at the Hilton at exactly noon. Bobby was waiting in the lobby, and I barely recognized him. The scrawny kid who used to steal my Halloween candy had grown into a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit, silver hair, perfectly styled looking, like he'd stepped out of a business magazine. When he saw me, his face cracked with an expression I couldn't quite read. Relief, anger, grief. Jesus, Maggie, he said, quietly pulling me into a hug that smelled like expensive cologne and success. What has that little bastard done to you? I'd planned to be strong, to pretend I was handling everything just fine, but feeling my brother's arms around me for the first time in years broke something loose inside me. I started crying right there in the fancy hotel lobby and couldn't seem to stop. Bobby steered me to a quiet corner and ordered coffee while I pulled myself together. Start from the beginning, he said, and for the next hour I told him everything. The deed, transfer, the overheard conversations, the changed locks, the 2 weeks of living in my car. Bobby's face grew darker with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. I made some money over the years, he said finally. I nodded. Bobby's success was family legend. He'd started with a single apartment building in Cleveland in his 20s and built an empire. What you probably don't know is that I've been watching David for a while. Not spying exactly, but paying attention. He's always struck me as, Bobby paused, searching for the right word, entitled, even as a kid. Remember Tom's funeral? I remembered. David had spent the entire reception talking about how expensive funeral costs were and wondering aloud if I really needed such an elaborate service. He cornered me that day. Bobby continued asking questions about your finances, how much Tom left you, whether you had a will, whether you'd considered simplifying your assets. I thought it was just grief talking, but now Bobby reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. I own 17 rental properties in Columbus, he said. Good neighborhoods, nice houses. One of them just became available this morning because I told the tenants to find somewhere else to live. He slid the envelope across the table. The keys are in there along with the deed. The house is yours, free and clear. Consider it back payment for all the Christmas presents I never sent. I stared at the envelope like it might disappear if I blinked. Bobby, I can't accept. Yes, you can. He interrupted. But that's not all. He pulled out a second envelope. This one smaller, but somehow heavier. There's also a cashier's check in there. $3 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. $3 million. I'd never seen that much money written on a check before. I don't understand, I whispered. Bobby smiled, and for a moment I could see the mischievous boy who used to help me catch fireflies in our backyard. I'm 66 years old, Maggie. I never had kids, never found the right woman to settle down with. My money is going to go to someone when I die, and I'd rather see what happens when I give it to you while I'm alive to enjoy watching. But why now? I asked. Bobby's expression hardened again. Because that son of yours is about to learn that you don't steal from a Sullivan. We might not talk much, but we're still family, and family protects family. He leaned forward. David thinks he's so clever, doesn't he? Thinks he played you perfectly. Wait until he finds out his homeless mother just became a millionaire. I looked at the envelopes again, hardly daring to believe they were real. What am I supposed to do with $3 million? Bobby's grin was absolutely wicked. Whatever you want, little sister. But if I were you, I'd start by making sure David knows exactly what he threw away when he changed those locks. The house Bobby gave me was in Upper Arlington, one of Columbus's most prestigious neighborhoods. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, hardwood floors throughout, and a kitchen that belonged in a home design magazine. It was twice the size of the house I'd shared with Tom and 100 times more luxurious than anywhere I'd ever imagined living. I spent my first week there just wandering, from room to room, touching surfaces and opening cabinets, trying to convince myself it was real. The master bedroom had a walk-in closet bigger than some apartments. The living room had a fireplace with a marble mantel and built-in bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling. The backyard had a garden that would make any retired teacher weep with joy. But the most satisfying part was setting up my new financial situation. Bobby had recommended a wealth management firm, and I spent an afternoon with a very serious young man named Christopher who explained investment portfolios and interest rates with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies. With conservative investments, he said, you could easily live on $200,000 per year without touching the principal. $200,000 per year, more than triple my teaching salary at its highest, more than David made at his engineering job. The irony was delicious. While he was renovating my old house to flip it for maybe $700,000 in profit, I was sitting on enough money to buy 10 houses just like it. I bought new clothes first, not flashy or expensive, just quality pieces that fit properly and made me feel like myself again. Then I bought a new car, trading in my Honda Civic for a silver Lexus that drove like a cloud and had more technology than the space shuttle. The salesman kept looking at my driver's license and then at my cashier's check, clearly wondering how a retired teacher could afford a $60,000 car. But I was still the same Maggie Sullivan who taught 3rd grade for 30 years. I couldn't just sit in my beautiful house spending money aimlessly. I needed a purpose, a plan, and slowly sitting in my new kitchen with my morning coffee, watching cardinals at the bird feeder Bobby had already installed in the backyard. That plan began to form. It started when I drove past my old house. One afternoon, the painters were gone, but there were landscapers working on the front yard and a dumpster full of what looked like my old furniture. I parked across the street and watched for a while, noting the expensive cars in the driveway. David's BMW and Vanessa's Range Rover, both newer than I remembered. They were spending money they hadn't even made yet, so confident in their real estate flip that they were already living like people who'd struck it rich. That's when I realized David had made a crucial error. He'd assumed that getting rid of me meant he'd won. He thought I was broken, defeated, probably living in some sad little apartment somewhere, nursing my wounds and accepting my fate. He had no idea that his desperate, homeless mother had not only landed on her feet, but had landed in luxury beyond his wildest dreams, which meant he also had no idea what was coming for him. I drove home and opened my laptop, spending the rest of the evening researching everything I could find about my son's finances. What I discovered made my new plan even sweeter. David and Vanessa weren't just living beyond their means. They were drowning in debt. Credit cards, car payments, a second mortgage on some investment property that wasn't panning out. They needed my house to sell quickly and for top dollar, or they were going to be in serious financial trouble. I smiled as I closed the laptop. David thought he'd been so clever manipulating his naive old mother, but he'd forgotten something important about teachers. We're very, very good at long-term planning, and I was about to teach him a lesson he'd never forget. 3 weeks into my new life as a secret millionaire, I was having coffee with my neighbor Janet when she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "Oh, by the way," she said casually, "I ran into your son, David, at the grocery store yesterday. Such a charming young man. He was telling me how worried he's been about you since you moved to that assisted living facility." I nearly choked on my coffee. Assisted living facility. So, that was the story David was telling people. Not that he'd locked his mother out of her own house, but that concerned David had helped his aging mother transition to professional care. The narrative was so perfect, so believable that even Janet, who'd known me for 15 years, had accepted it without question. "He seemed so relieved that you're getting proper care," Janet continued. "He said you'd been having some memory issues, and it wasn't safe for you to live alone anymore." Memory issues. I wanted to laugh at the audacity, but instead I just smiled and murmured something non-committal about adjusting to my new living situation. Let David think his story was working. Let him believe he'd covered all his bases. That afternoon I called a private investigator Bobby had recommended. Patricia Reynolds was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who specialized in financial fraud cases. "I need to know everything about my son's business dealings," I told her. "Every debt, every asset, every financial move he's made in the past 5 years." Patricia quoted me a fee that would have seemed astronomical 6 months ago, but now felt like pocket change. "One more thing," I added. "I need to know about the house." My house, what they're really planning to do with it. Patricia nodded and made notes. "Most people think they're smarter than they are when it comes to covering their tracks," she said. "Give me 2 weeks. While Patricia did her work, I did mine. I contacted Harold Weinstein, my old attorney, and asked him to quietly research whether there was any legal recourse for the way the deed transfer had been handled. "Maggie," Harold said carefully, "elder abuse cases are complicated, especially when family members are involved. But if we can prove fraud or undue influence," he trailed off meaningfully. I also began cultivating my new image as the tragic mother. I joined a support group for seniors dealing with family estrangement. I volunteered at the library where I'd spent so many homeless days, making sure to mention to other volunteers how difficult it had been to adjust to assisted living after my son decided it was best for everyone. I was careful never to sound bitter, just sad and confused, a woman who couldn't quite understand how she'd ended up separated from her family. The beauty of the performance was that most of it was true. I was sad. I was confused about how my own son could have betrayed me so thoroughly. The only lie was about where I was living, and that lie served a larger truth. David had indeed tried to force me into assisted living, had indeed stolen my house, had indeed abandoned me when I needed him most. 2 weeks later, Patricia called with a report that exceeded my wildest expectations. "Your son is in deep financial trouble," she began. "He and his wife have $700,000 in debt spread across 14 different credit cards and loans. They've been using balance transfers and cash advances to stay afloat, but they're running out of options." She paused for emphasis. "They need that house to sell for at least $800,000, or they're looking at bankruptcy within 6 months." But that wasn't the most interesting part of Patricia's report. "There's something else," she said. the renovation work on your old house. They're cutting corners in ways that could be dangerous. Unlicensed electrical work, unpermitted plumbing, changes, structural modifications that haven't been inspected. If the right person reported this to the city, she let the implication hang in the air. I thanked Patricia and hung up the phone, my mind racing. David wasn't just greedy and cruel. He was desperate and stupid. He'd put himself in a position where he needed everything to go perfectly with no room for error or bad luck. How unfortunate it would be if his luck took a turn for the worse. The anonymous tip I called into the Columbus building department was made from a pay phone at a gas station, using a voice slightly shakier and more elderly than my actual tone. I'm concerned about the construction work going on at 1247 Maple Street, I told the inspector who answered. There are workers there at all hours, and I'm not sure they have proper permits. As a neighbor, I'm worried about safety issues. The building inspector assured me they'd look into it, and 3 days later, I drove by to see a city truck parked in my old driveway and 2 officials with clipboards walking around the property. Through my new car's tinted windows, I watched David standing on the front porch, his face red with what I assumed was a combination of anger and panic. But that was just the opening move. The real strategy required more patience and much better timing. I spent the next week studying David and Vanessa's routine, something that would have felt impossibly creepy 6 months ago, but now seemed like necessary intelligence gathering. They left for work at the same time each morning, came home around 6:30, and went out on Friday nights to what appeared to be the same upscale restaurant downtown. I also began making strategic appearances around town. At the Kroger where David shopped, I ran into his co-worker Jim Peterson, who mentioned how stressed David had been lately about some family situation with his mom. I played my part perfectly, sighing sadly about how difficult it was to adjust to assisted living and how much I missed my old life. David seems like such a good son, though, Jim said, always talking about wanting what's best for his mother. I smiled wistfully and agreed that David had always been thoughtful, letting Jim draw his own conclusions about what kind of man would put his loving mother in assisted living while selling her house. The building department citation arrived at David's workplace on a Tuesday. Patricia had discovered he'd listed his office address on all the construction permits. The violations were extensive: electrical work that didn't meet code, plumbing changes that required inspection, and structural modifications that needed engineer approval. All work had to stop immediately until the violations were resolved. I knew about the citation because I'd taken to driving by the house every afternoon around 4 o'clock. A routine I told myself was just curiosity, but was really a form of psychological torture. For David, not for me. I was enjoying every moment. The construction crews disappeared overnight. The coming soon real estate sign that had appeared the week before was quietly removed. That Friday evening, instead of going to their usual restaurant, David and Vanessa stayed home. I parked across the street at 7 o'clock and watched through their lit windows as what appeared to be a very heated argument unfolded in my former living room. Vanessa was pacing, gesturing dramatically, while David sat slumped in a chair with his head in his hands. I wondered what they were saying to each other. Were they blaming each other for the permit problems? Were they calculating how much the delays would cost? Were they finally realizing that their carefully planned financial crime was falling apart? I hoped it was all. 3. The next morning, I received a call that made my week. It was Harold Weinstein with news about my legal research. "Maggie, I've been looking into the circumstances of your deed transfer," he said. "If we can establish that you were coerced or that David misrepresented the nature of the documents you were signing, we might have grounds for a lawsuit. More importantly, we might be able to void the transfer entirely." Void the transfer. The The words were beautiful. David could spend all the money he wanted renovating the house, could take on all the debt he needed to finance his construction project, and in the end, I could potentially reclaim legal ownership and leave him holding nothing but a pile of unpaid bills. But that felt almost too easy, too clean. David deserved something more creative, more personal, more devastating than a simple legal reversal. He deserved to suffer the way he'd made me suffer, to feel as helpless and betrayed as I'd felt standing on my own front porch with nowhere to go. That's when I began planning the final phase of my revenge, the part that would require perfect timing and absolutely no mercy. The first sign that David was cracking came through Janet, who'd seen him at the hardware store looking absolutely haggard. According to her gossip network, he'd been there 3 times in 1 week buying materials and returning them the next day. Financial troubles. Janet whispered knowingly. You can always tell when people are having money problems. They start making impulsive purchases they can't afford, then panicking about the cost. I could have told Janet exactly what David's financial troubles were, thanks to Patricia's continued monitoring of his situation. The building permit delays had cost him 2 months of construction, time, and somewhere around $50,000 in rework and inspection fees. His credit cards were maxed out. He'd borrowed against his 401k, and he'd even taken out a title loan against his BMW. But the most delicious detail was what Patricia discovered about David's timeline. He'd already signed a contract with a buyer contingent on the renovation work being completed by December 1st. If the house wasn't ready by then, not only would he lose the sale, but he'd have to pay a penalty fee of $50,000. With all his permit problems, finishing by December 1st was looking increasingly impossible. Meanwhile, I was living my best life. I joined a book club, started taking piano lessons for the first time since I was 12, and was planning a trip to Italy for the spring. The money Bobby had given me wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming a life I'd forgotten I wanted. Every morning, I woke up in my beautiful house and remembered that I was free in ways I'd never been before. But freedom, I was learning, also meant the freedom to be absolutely ruthless when the situation called for it. Which is why when David finally reached out to me, I was ready. The call came on a Thursday evening in early November. I was reading in my living room when my phone rang and David's name appeared on the screen for the first time in 2 months. I let it ring 3 times before answering, keeping my voice carefully neutral. Hello, David. Mom. His voice sounded strained, exhausted. Mom, I need to talk to you. I know things have been complicated between us, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? As if locking me out of my own house was some sort of communication error that could be cleared up with a heart-to-heart conversation. I'm listening, I said simply. David took a shaky breath. The thing is, Mom, there are some problems with the house renovation, legal issues that I didn't anticipate, and I was wondering if you might consider if there was any way you could help us financially with some of the unexpected costs. Help them financially. The audacity was breathtaking. The son who'd made me homeless was calling to ask for money. What kind of help are you talking about, David? I asked, allowing just a hint of my old maternal concern to creep into my voice. Maybe 50,000, he said, quickly. Just temporary until we can get the house sold. I know assisted living is expensive, but if you have any savings left, or if you could take out a loan against your pension. He was babbling now, desperation making him careless with his words. David, I interrupted gently. I'm living in assisted living on a fixed income. I don't have $50,000. It wasn't technically a lie. I didn't have $50,000. I had $3 million. But David didn't need to know that. The silence stretched out for almost 30 seconds. When David spoke again, his voice was different. Harder. Mom, you have to understand. If this house renovation fails, Vanessa and I could lose everything. Our cars, our credit, maybe even our jobs if we have. To declare bankruptcy. You're my mother. Doesn't that mean anything to you? And there it was. The same manipulation he'd used to get me to sign over the deed. The same emotional blackmail wrapped in a concern for family obligation. Except, this time I wasn't a lonely widow desperate for connection with her only child. This time I had options. David, I said, quietly, I think you should come visit me. We should have this conversation in person. He agreed. Immediately, probably thinking he'd have better luck manipulating me face to face. We arranged for him to come by the following Saturday afternoon. After I hung up, I sat in my elegant living room and smiled. David thought he was coming to convince a desperate old woman to bail him out of his financial troubles. Instead, he was walking straight into the final act of a play I'd been directing for months. Saturday couldn't come soon enough. Saturday morning, I received a call that changed everything. It was Patricia Reynolds with information so explosive I had to sit down while she explained it. Maggie, you need to know something else about your son's financial situation. That house, renovation, it's not just cutting corners on permits. David took out a construction loan using fraudulent income statements. He claimed he was making twice his actual salary. Bank fraud. David hadn't just betrayed his mother. He'd committed multiple felonies in the process. There's more, Patricia continued. I found records showing he's been forging your signature on documents, even after you moved out. He's been taking cash advances on credit cards, opened in your name, using your old address as the contact information. Identity theft, forgery. My son hadn't just stolen my house. He'd been systematically destroying my credit and my name for months. I felt physically sick thinking about what could have happened if Bobby hadn't rescued me, if I'd been trapped in assisted living, while David ruined my financial reputation and racked up debt in my name. How much? I asked quietly. Patricia's pause told me everything. So far, about $200,000 across 8 different accounts. But Maggie, here's the thing. If you reported this to the authorities, David wouldn't just face civil penalties. He'd be looking at serious federal charges. Mail fraud, identity theft, bank fraud. We're talking about potential prison time. Prison time. The word should have shocked me, but instead I felt a cold satisfaction settling into my bones. David had crossed every line, violated every trust, committed crimes that went far beyond simple family betrayal. He'd gambled that his homeless, powerless mother would never find out about his systematic destruction of her identity and credit. He'd gambled wrong. I thanked Patricia and spent the rest of the morning thinking David would be at my door in a few hours, expecting to manipulate his elderly mother into bailing him out of a crisis he'd created. He had no idea that his elderly mother was now wealthy beyond his dreams, and in possession of evidence that could send him to federal prison. At exactly 2 o'clock, my doorbell rang. I checked my appearance in the hallway mirror. I dressed carefully for this moment, choosing clothes that looked respectable, but not expensive. When I opened the door, David was standing there holding a bouquet of white roses, the same flowers he'd brought to his father's funeral. His face was thinner than I remembered, and there were dark circles under his eyes that told the story of sleepless nights and mounting desperation. "Hi, Mom," he said, offering the flowers with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You look good. Assisted living seems to be agreeing with you." I accepted the roses without comment and invited him in, watching his face as he took in my living space for the first time. His reaction was everything I'd hoped for. David's mouth literally fell open as he looked around my elegant living room with its marble fireplace and expensive furnishings. "Mom," he said slowly, "this doesn't look like assisted living. This looks like," he trailed off, unable to process what he was seeing. Like what, David? I asked pleasantly, settling into my favorite armchair and gesturing for him to sit on the sofa. He remained standing, turning in a slow circle to take in the high ceilings, the hardwood floors, the crystal chandelier that had probably cost more than his car. "This looks like a millionaire's house," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I smiled and reached for the tea service I'd prepared earlier, taking my time with the ritual of pouring and adding sugar, while David stood frozen in the middle of my living room, clearly trying to understand how his homeless mother had ended up in luxury that exceeded his wildest dreams. "David," I said calmly, "we need to talk about those credit cards you've been opening in my name and the construction loan you fraudulently obtained using fake income statements and the $200,000 you've stolen from me over the past 8 months. The white roses fell from his nerveless fingers and scattered across my Persian rug like snow. The silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity, while David's face went through a fascinating series of expressions: confusion, realization, panic, and finally a kind of desperate calculation. I could practically see his mind racing, trying to figure out how much I knew and whether there was any way to talk himself out of the corner he'd painted himself into. "Mom," he said, finally, his voice carefully controlled, "I think there's been some confusion. If there are financial irregularities, I can explain everything. The construction loan paperwork was complicated, and maybe there were some errors." I held up my hand to stop him, and something in my expression made him fall silent immediately. "David, sit down." It wasn't a request. He sank onto my sofa like a marionette with cut strings, and I took a moment to study my son's face. When had he become such a stranger to me? When had the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard turned into a man who could look me in the eye while systematically destroying my life? "I know about all of it," I said quietly. "The fake income statements, the credit cards opened in my name, the forged signatures, the $200,000 you've stolen from me over 8 months. I know about the building code violations, the unpermitted work, the buyer's contract. That expires in 3 weeks. I know you're facing bankruptcy if that house doesn't sell, and I know you've committed multiple federal crimes in the process." David's face went ashen. "How could you possibly know all that?" I smiled. "Because, David, I'm not the helpless old woman you thought you were manipulating. I'm not living in assisted living. I'm not struggling on a fixed income. And I'm not the same person who signed over her house deed because she was so desperate for her son's love and approval." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at my beautiful garden. "Would you like to know where I've been living since you locked me out of my own house? Would you like to know how I went from homeless to living in a house worth more than yours in the span of 6 weeks?" David said nothing, but I could feel his eyes following my every movement. "Your Uncle Bobby gave me this house, David. Free and clear. No mortgage, no strings attached. He also gave me $3 million to start over with." I turned back to face him and watched all the color drain from his face. $3 million, David. More money than you'll make in your entire lifetime, even if you manage to avoid prison. Prison? The word came out as barely a whisper. I returned to my chair and picked up a manila folder I'd placed on the side table earlier. Bank fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, forgery. According to my attorney, you're looking at potentially 15 to 20 years in federal prison, not to mention complete financial ruin and the certainty that you'll never work in engineering again. David was shaking now, his hands gripping his knees so tightly his knuckles were white. "Mom, please, I can explain everything. The financial pressure, the debt, the fear of losing everything we worked for." "Everything you worked for?" I interrupted. "David, you worked for nothing. You stole everything. You stole my house. You stole my money. You stole my identity. And you tried to steal my dignity by telling everyone I was a confused old woman who needed assisted living. I opened the folder and spread Patricia's investigation report across the coffee table between us. Bank statements, forged documents, credit applications, loan paperwork. The evidence is overwhelming. David, you left a paper trail that a first-year law student could follow. You were so confident that your stupid mother would never find out what you were doing that you got careless. What do you want? He asked finally, his voice hollow. The question I'd been waiting for. The moment when my son would finally understand that the balance of power between us had shifted completely and permanently. What do I want? I repeated thoughtfully. I want you to understand what it feels like to lose everything that matters to you. I want you to know what it's like to be betrayed by the person you trusted most in the world. I want you to experience the kind of helplessness and desperation you forced me to live with. I closed the folder and smiled. The good news, David, is that I'm not going to send you to prison. I'm not going to call the FBI or press charges or destroy your life the way you tried to destroy mine. His face flooded with relief so profound I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The bad news, I continued, is that I'm also not going to help you. Not with money, not with loans, not with anything. You're going to face the consequences of your choices all by yourself, just like you forced me to do. Your house renovation will fail. You'll lose your buyer. You'll face bankruptcy, and you'll have no one to blame but yourself. I stood up and walked to the front door, opening it wide. Those are beautiful roses, David, I said, looking down at the scattered flowers on my rug. White roses for new beginnings. How fitting. This is definitely a new beginning for both of us. The difference is mine includes $3 million and the most beautiful house in Upper Arlington. Yours includes bankruptcy, professional ruin, and the knowledge that the mother you threw away like garbage is living better than you ever will. David stumbled to his feet and walked toward the door like a man in a trance. When he reached the threshold, he turned back one more time. Mom, I'm sorry, he said, and for the first time since he'd arrived, his voice sounded like the little boy I'd once loved. Unconditionally. I know you are, David, I replied gently. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry your plan failed. You're sorry you underestimated me. But you're not sorry you tried to destroy me, because if you had succeeded, you'd be celebrating right now instead of apologizing. I closed the door and locked it, then returned to my living room, where the scattered white roses were the only evidence that my son had ever been there at all. Through the window, I watched him drive away in his BMW, probably for the last time before the bank repossessed it. Then I called Bobby to tell him the good news. David's lesson was complete and justice had finally been served. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.